It's the 1440s. The French have finally won the 100 Years' War, and England was updating its plan. 50 years later, this happened. Extra, extra! Read all about it! Christopher Columbus had just found some land! And after everyone found out that this wasn't India, countries across Western Europe were trying to take a piece of this new world. But England decided to expand its empire somewhere else. Until finally in 1607, where the English started a colony in Jamestown, Virginia. And that colony would expand for the next 150-ish years, until the 1750s, where everything fell into chaos. Pay attention to this area. This area belonged to the French and British. One day, the French were like, I'm going to put some forts here. Don't. Yeah, I'm actually going to put some forts here. Don't! Did someone say something? So, yeah. The French put some forts down, and on 1754, the French and Indian War began, which would be part of the 7 Years' War, which would start 2 years later. And finally, in 1763, the British won the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. But it came with a cost. 60 million pounds. So because of the fact that the British literally fought a war to protect the colonies, the British hoped that the colonies would help pay for that huge debt. So they taxed them. So in 1764, the Sugar Act began, where any imports from Britain would be taxed. 1 year later, there was the Stamp Act, where basically any paper item, including books, cards, newspapers, envelopes, and stamps from the United Kingdom, were also taxed. This angered the colonists, with protests about no taxation without representation. And one boycott later, the acts were repealed. What the? So in 1767, there was the Townshend Acts, where every single thing from the United Kingdom was taxed. So now the colonists were even angry about this, and now, because of that, the Townshend Acts were repealed after another boycott, and most taxes were repealed. The British retaliated with King George III to send British troops to Boston in 1768. Why Boston? Well, that's just because that's where all the boycotts were happening. So these British soldiers went into every colonist's house, being paid to stay there with no choice, to make sure that the colonists didn't do anything funny. So this would start a standoff between colony versus crown, and on March 5th, 1770, something unthinkable happened. 3 days prior, a colonist made fun of a British soldier. A fight broke out. Now, a different colonist made fun of a different soldier, and you want to know what the soldier did? He just walked away like none of this ever happened. But a British soldier that was next to him wanted the colonists to be more respectful. So because of that, the British soldier whacked the colonist in the head, and a crowd grew around him. He was cornered at the door of the customs house, and British soldiers came out to help him out. The colonists shouted profanities and insults and threw a bunch of stuff at them, like rocks, snowballs, and glass shards, and they heard a screaming in the background. Fire! The commander told them to stop, but it was already too late. 5 people died that night in the Boston Massacre, which I rather preferred the Boston killing, but because of American propaganda reasons, we're just stuck with this name. Things got worse in the years that followed. Remember when I said that most taxes were repealed? Well, tea was still taxed. And on December 16th, 1773, the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Indians and went to the Dartmouth and sunk some tea into the sea. The British were now very mad at this, and Massachusetts, including Boston, were now under the direct rule of the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, states across the 13 colonies had a discussion in the First Continental Congress. When they made a letter to King George III to make peace, the king replied, no. So now war was about to begin. And on the night of April 18th, 1775, Paul Revere warned the Minutemen on the Redcoats' attack on Lexington, which was about 20 miles away from Boston. And on the dawn of April 19th, 1775, both sides stared at each other in Lexington. And then one man fires. War begins. The British pushed the colonists all the way back to Concord, where the colonists pushed the British all the way back to Boston. The colonists surrounded the British in Boston, so now the British were now trapped. 1 month later, on May 10th, 1775, two things happened. One had to do with this guy, Benedict Arnold, in Fort Ticonderoga, where Benedict Arnold wanted to take over Fort Ticonderoga, where they met a certain group of people, the Green Mountain Boys. They both invaded Fort Ticonderoga, and now the Fort Ticonderoga was under American hands. Kind of. I'll get to that later. So, the second thing happened in Philadelphia, where the states had a discussion again in the Second Continental Congress, where everyone agreed to let George Washington, former colonel of the French and Indian War, as the new commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. So Washington was now on his way to Boston, where the colonists had their first failed battle. This was Bunker Hill, and this was Breed's Hill, and they were both under quote-unquote American occupation. And on June 17th, 1775, the British attacked the hills. 3 hours later, because of lack of ammunition, the colonists had to retreat. Although it did lose less casualties than the British. When Washington finally arrived in July of 1775, the Continental Army was officially established. And then after that, nothing much actually happened in 1775. Benedict Arnold wanted to invade Canada, only for that to fail miserably. And the French and the Spanish sent aid to the Americans. Quote-unquote Americans. I'll get to that. In 1776, we have this guy, Henry Knox, where he and his men sent weapons from Fort Ticonderoga all the way to Boston. They put the guns right next to the Continental Army troops, where the British knew that they were 100% surrounded. They had nowhere to go but out. And they finally left on March of 1776. Boston was liberated. Now let me go back 2 months earlier with this guy, Thomas Paine, who just published a pamphlet called Common Sense. Why did I say this now? Philadelphia, June 1776. Inspired by Common Sense and requested by Congress, Thomas Jefferson made the Declaration of Independence. And on July 2nd, Congress had to vote on either if it should be approved or not approved of its final draft. John Dickinson told everyone that they need a constitution before actually declaring an independent nation. He wanted the Articles of Confederation, written by Benjamin Franklin and edited by himself, to be the Constitution of the United States. But in the end, the final draft was approved by Congress. The United Colonies of North America were now the United States of America. August 22nd, 1776. The British were back, and they set a camp on Staten Island, while the American troops waited at Dorchester Heights. Wondering what the British were doing, they kinda decided to calm down and keep preparing before the actual attack. And then they invaded. And the chase was on. They passed Dorchester Heights, and the colonists were pushed all the way back to southern Pennsylvania. Then a crisis hit on the American states. How could they defeat one of the biggest empires on planet Earth? they had literally no chance of winning, right? Southern Pennsylvania, December 1776. It was winter, so the war was paused. And the United Kingdom made an ally, the Holy Roman Empire, the eastern territory of the Kingdom of the Franks, specifically the Hesse region, and they were supposed to take care of central New Jersey while the British took care of northern New Jersey and southern New York. So, Washington made a plan. Because the Hessians were new to the American states, and they were guarding Trenton, let's attack Trenton. So on Christmas of 1776, they were getting ready to cross the Delaware River and head to Trenton. When they finally arrived, the Hessians were surprised to see the Americans here. After all, it was winter. So anyway, the Americans pushed the British and Hessians all the way back to northeastern New Jersey. Meanwhile, in Europe, the memories of the 7 Years' War never really went away. And the French were still salty about losing the 7 Years' War, with a revolution on the rise. But when the Americans wanted help, they couldn't at that time. They were in a huge debt, and unless there's an assured victory, then they won't join. Montreal and New York, June 1777. So, General Burgoyne and Howe made an agreement to invade New York and meet in the middle, cutting communication lines between New England and the rest of the states. But when Burgoyne started invading New York, they were halted at Bennington. Well, Howe was invading Pennsylvania, so the capital had to be moved to York. And finally, in the Battle of Saratoga, which lasted for almost a month, Burgoyne's army was out of the country. And now the French were in the war. King George III asked if Burgoyne and Howe can come home, leaving only Henry Clinton to be in charge of southern Pennsylvania and New York City. Then winter came again, and the colonists made a camp at Valley Forge. The Prussians trained the Americans, and in 1778, the Americans were ready to invade Philadelphia. But right when they were about to do it, the British just abandoned Philadelphia and moved all of its military forces to New York City. And then June 17th, 1779, the Spanish declared war on the British. If you look at this map here, the British have to fight the Americans in the east and the Spanish in the west. And when the French arrived, they would also have to retaliate them too, making it a two-front war. And a two-front war means bad news. In 1779, they took over this part. But now they have this whole territory, with Georgia and South Carolina mostly invaded. And in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in 1781, hoping that this would be the battle to get rid of the British in the southern states, it did take a huge toll on the British, but it actually gave them even more territory. But then there was Virginia, which had all the supplies and aid for the Continental Army. The British had to invade Virginia. So they abandoned the Carolinas and went to Yorktown. So Washington sent a kind message to Clinton, and the Americans and the French went down to Yorktown. And finally, after 20 days, the British had enough and surrendered. But the Americans thought that there would be one final battle in New York City, until September 3rd, 1783, where the Treaty of Paris was signed, and the game was over. The United States were victorious. George Washington resigned after the war ended and wanted to be a normal citizen. But that didn't end up happening. There was an election for if George Washington can be the first leader of the USA, and it was a unanimous vote for yes. But what would George Washington call himself? Not King of the United States. He gave himself a new name, President of the United States, where they can serve up to 2 terms, and all laws had to be under the Constitution. Not the Articles of Confederation, but the Constitution we know of today. Fast forward to present day, and here we are. 1 nation, 50 states, and 242 years of history. Thanks for watching, and God bless America.